Hi, everybody. After yesterday's class, I realized there was still some confusion about active transport and passive transport. You have a couple of your classmates to thank because they asked me to go over it again. So in passive or active mechanisms, we have the transfer of water or solutes, which are molecules or particles, across a semi-permeable membrane. It lets some things through and not others, right? These membranes separate the intracellular fluid from the extracellular fluid. They're in the capillary beds, okay? So for passive transport, you have to almost think of it like the ocean and waterfalls, right? They just kind of happen automatically. So they require no actual energy. Nobody's making it happen. Mother Nature's making it happen. But what I mean by that is in osmosis, diffusion, and filtration, Mother Nature is making those things happen as well. Osmosis is the movement of water. Diffusion is the movement of particles or molecules or solutes, all the same thing. And filtration is what happens with hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure has to do with the fluid staying in the blood vessels and not leaking out. And hydrostatic pressure has to do with the fluid leaving the blood vessels and going into the capillary bed. So in osmosis, we have the passive transport of water. Water moves from an area of less concentration of solutes to an area of more concentration of solutes. The containers do not have to be the same height or the same amount of water that's in a closed space, but they have to have a balanced relationship. Each compartment has its own relationship of what should be solutes to water. So what happens is the fluid will shift automatically to dilute down the side that is too concentrated. So here we have a picture. It's showing how it looks before. So this is one container, this is another container. Say one of them is the cell, one of them is the interstitial fluid or the intravascular fluid, and there's a semi-permeable membrane there. So in this situation, what's happening is the water is actually going to move from this less concentrated side to the more concentrated side to dilute it. So over here, you can see what that is. If you divided this part of the container in 4, this would be 25% of the container. There are 7 particles in there. There were 7 particles to begin with, but it was just very dilute at that point. So right now there's 7 particles. Think of them as 7 M&Ms in 25% volume. We'll call it 25 mLs just to make it easy. All right. On this side, say this is 100 mLs. It's going to have 4 times the amount of solutes, otherwise known as 4 times the amount of M&Ms. So if you counted up all of these solutes that are here right now, I can guarantee that it equals 28 because I counted them just before. So the water moves. Right? The water does not have to equal out exactly, but the relationship of the solutes to the water has to equal out. So here, same amount of water, different amount of concentration. Highly concentrated, less concentrated. The water moves, so everything ends up being kind of medium concentrated, right? All looks the same. Okay. So the way we express the number of particles that are in a fluid is as osmol, right? So it's the number of particles of a solute per kilogram of water. The more solutes you have, the higher the osmolality is. So the next form of passive transport we have across a semi-permeable membrane is diffusion. But we're not talking about moving water anymore or fluid. We're talking about moving molecules that are, we call them solutes or particles. So the solutes are going to move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So the fluid does not move, the particles move. All right? They're going to move until both sides of the membrane have an equal number of particles. You can see that in this example here. It is a container that is full of water, right? So this is one container. It has a semi-permeable membrane separating the two compartments. The water level is the same on both sides, but the concentration of solutes is not. In this example, the water is not going to shift. The solutes are going to shift. So they're going to come from this area right here that's more concentrated and going to shift across the semi-permeable membrane to the other side. And then over a period of time, this is how they end up. They end up equal on both sides. So when we talk about filtration, we're talking about the movement of both water and smaller particles from an area of high pressure to one of low pressure. So we're not talking about how dilute it is, we're talking about the pressure, right? So in hydrostatic pressure, it takes place in the bloodstream and it allows for normal circulation. Think of it as a pushing force. The blood is moving from the high pressure arterial system to the lower pressure capillaries and veins, where only solutes of a certain size can pass through. So it's the pushing out from the bloodstream into the capillaries, nourishing the cells, and then the pressure lowers on the venous end so the blood can return. Osmotic pressure is the power of a solution to draw water. It literally like pulls it in or keeps it in. There's more molecules in the solution. So in the blood vessel, the plasma proteins, which is albumin, is what helps keep the fluid in the vascular space so it does not leak out. So if you think of hydrostatic as pushing water, osmotic pressure is pulling water based on the number of particles. Filtration pressure is when the high pressure moves the fluid and solutes out into the arterial end of the capillary. The low pressure allows blood to be returned in the venule side of the capillary. All right. So that's the difference, is when the filtration is high pressure, it's moving out. And when it's low pressure, it's moving back into the blood vessels. All right. This seems to cause people some grief as well, active transport. So in active transport, you're talking about going against the laws of nature. So you're talking about things that would not normally move. For example, there's more potassium inside the cell than there is outside the cell. But if your potassium level is a little lower in the cell than it should be, then by the sodium-potassium pump, which requires ATP as its energy, the potassium is going to enter the sodium-potassium pump on the cell membrane, and it's going to push it into the cell. It requires ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is another part that seems to be causing a little bit of grief. It's about the way that hormones help to regulate the fluid balance in our body. Antidiuretic hormone, there are sensors inside your blood vessels that will either stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone to make your kidneys conserve water, or inhibit the release of antidiuretic hormone to make your body excrete more fluid. Just by its very name, antidiuretic, you can figure out that when there's more antidiuretic, you're going to make less urine. If the fluid volume in your blood vessels still remains low, then the enzyme renin is going to be released, and that is going to stimulate the hormone angiotensin to convert to angiotensin 2, and that is going to cause the kidneys to hold on to both sodium and water. If the fluid volume still remains low, the angiotensin will stimulate the release of aldosterone, which is also a hormone, and aldosterone will also help to retain sodium and water. But the bad news is you lose potassium in the meantime. Your thyroid hormone also is involved in your fluid balance, and the BNP, brain natriuretic peptide. As your thyroid hormone goes up, your cardiac output goes up. It increases your glomerular filtration rate in your kidney, and then your urine output picks up. So when you need to excrete more fluid, the release of thyroid hormone will help you do that. This is the brain natriuretic peptide, BNP. It's measured in the serum, which is part of your blood system, and this value increases in congestive heart failure. So we use it in the hospital as like a quick marker to tell us how bad the person's congestive heart failure is. The higher the number is, the worse it is. Everybody should be below 100, but for somebody with congestive heart failure, their value is going to be greater than 100. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is acid-base balance. When you look at the range of numbers on the acid-base scale, it goes anywhere from 0 to 14. The lower the number, the more acidic. The higher the number, the more alkaline. Your blood wants to live in a very tight range. It wants the pH to be within 7.35 and 7.45. You can see here on this example that below 6.9 is going to lead to the person's death, and above 7.8 as well. So when the person is in acidosis or alkalosis, we have a little bit of time to fix it before the person deteriorates further. So the compensatory mechanisms that happen have to do with excreting or retaining carbon dioxide and excreting or retaining bicarbonate. The respiratory system works pretty quickly. So if the person is retaining carbon dioxide in the respiratory system, the brain will automatically instruct your brainstem to increase the respirations both in quantity and in depth. If it needs to slow things down, because like say you're hyperventilating, then it's going to try to trigger you to slow down, to lower your pH when your pH is too low, to try to raise it, have you hold on to a little bit more carbon dioxide. As the last line of defense is the kidneys. The reason being is it takes too long. So It's about the bicarbonate.